I'm really excited to have Mike McCue on revolution.social. Mike is someone who I have admired for many years, someone who for the last couple years has produced a great podcast called .social, looking into this project to bring social media back to protocols, to make the Fediverse real, and really sort of reclaim social media and make it more like the internet that we all wanted. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Rabble. It is fantastic to be here.
You've had a long career and you've done so much, all the way back to being an executive at Netscape and bringing the browser to the mainstream. And that, to me, is really useful to understand where we're at. There's a couple points in your career which I think are really useful for us to talk about. One is the transition from AOL and CompuServes of the world, these sort of walled garden internet services that weren't open, to the world of Netscape, the world of the web. And then you were on the board of Twitter at what I think was the most pivotal time in Twitter's history before Elon showed up, which was when Twitter moved from an open app ecosystem focused on open APIs to trying to bring everything in-house. And I've brought Jeff Jarvis on this podcast where we talked about his experience as Uber Media, where they were the sort of the other side of that conflict that led Twitter to shut down its API. And then you created Flipboard, this open internet tool for finding content and curating content and an example of the internet we have. And the last couple of years, you've been really working on open social, not the open social that was Facebook 2 decades ago, but like these open social protocols in the Fediverse. And so I'm just so happy to have you on here because you've been there at these sort of 3 different transition points as the internet opened up and closed down, and now we're opening up again.
Thank you for that awesome summary, Rabble. And of course, I've been there. You've been there with me in some of these moments in time too, like particularly at Twitter. And each of these moments I think of them as defining moments. And sometimes, all times we learn from them. And there are a lot of lessons from each of these moments that now I've incorporated into how we're proceeding with product, how we're proceeding with evangelism, how we're proceeding with, advancing this ecosystem. And so there's a lot of lessons learned. There's some successes, some failures along the way.
Yep.
But that is, that's right. It's played out in as the internet's had these defining moments, as Twitter had these defining moments, all of this is culminating now. And I have to tell you, after all of those, I've never been more optimistic than I am now about how the internet is going to develop and how the social media world and ecosystem is going to develop into a much more open, connected experience for people, independent of app, independent of platform. And simultaneously along the way, thinking through not just how are people connected, how does the user experience work, but also how does the ecosystem actually sustain itself, from a monetization, financial point of view, how does it sustain itself from a community dynamics point of view? There's, building sustainability into this from the get-go is super important.
Before Elon Musk took over Twitter and renamed it X, we had this idea that these platforms might be doing wrong, but people believed them that they were trying to be neutral players. And then Elon took over Twitter. He said that he's basically going to use it as a bludgeon for changing politics. He's going to use it to try and get Trump elected. And then, Zuckerberg and others are like, well, let's get rid of that DEI stuff. Let's get rid of that inclusion stuff. Let's, go all alt-right. And ironically enough, that was what convinced people to re-look at the open alternatives. Look at the Fediverse. And I think that part of what you were very aware of the Fediverse for a really long time, but it's what helped encourage you and Flipboard to start investing in it.
Yes, absolutely. That was a really key moment in time where people started to actually think, maybe we do need an alternative to these walled gardens, to Twitter, to Facebook. When people started to then look for alternatives, they found Mastodon. And Mastodon was built on ActivityPub. And so then the notion of ActivityPub, which was, created back in 2016, as part, it's part of the W3C, standards bodies. And it is a phenomenal advancement in how social media works, because what ActivityPub represents, and as does AppProto and Noster, is standardizing the way people are connected on the internet, a standard for human connection. And that is such a powerful concept when you really think about it. Before I joined Netscape, we talked to Mark Andreessen about them buying my first startup, Paper Software. And ultimately, I decided that was a good idea. I would join Netscape. But my friends and other folks I knew at the time thought I was crazy for doing it. They were like, Mike, nobody uses the internet. Nobody, if I want to be online, I just take my CD-ROM and I pop it in and I go on the AOL and I just click on, travel or whatever. And it just works. And with the internet, you have to like download. What does download even mean? And you have to type into like this thing called a browser and put like HTTP. He's like, it's never going to happen. These folks that would tell me like, you're insane. It will never happen. And, that of course we know what happened is because
But the web was so much worse than AOL. Like the
it
web that
was
everyone
initially,
switched to.
it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was incredibly clunky. And but what happened was there was a protocol that connected content and rendered content in an open model that any browser could use. And what that led to were developers and content creators, publishers, everybody deciding, well, wait a minute, instead of me having to go cut a business development deal with AOL to be online, I can go build my own online presence. And so you decentralized the innovation that was locked up inside of AOL. And now you had tens of thousands of developers, content creators doing all sorts of cool things, pushing the protocols even further. And then we had the web. And, if we didn't have that, there would be no Airbnb today. Amazon wouldn't exist. Netflix wouldn't have happened. Like, it's amazing to think about that. But all of that was enabled because we created a common protocol for connecting content. Now we have a common protocol finally for connecting people. And that is just as big, if not even bigger.
Yeah. It's fascinating because it took so long to get from the protocol to connect content, web pages and links, to the one in which we have people connected. It's not like we didn't try.
Right.
We tried. There was, OpenID and a whole bunch of protocols, RSS, and which is still used today widely as podcasting, but
Right.
not for the original use anymore very often. And, for me to understand how we ended up in this world, we made a deal. We made a deal in 2004 to 2007, which was, we're not going to try and just build all our own software. Indie web, everybody compile and run it yourself, set up your own servers, which was very, very hard. We're going to use these new smartphones. We're going to use these apps. We're going to provide an integrated experience, and we get to all connect. And the platforms agree to be open enough. And that was Twitter's thing. And this is, Jack Dorsey goes back and says that, his mistake was making Twitter a protocol and not a company. But we tried to make Twitter federated. I don't know if you knew this, but in 2008, we actually built the federation with Jaiku, and the technology didn't work. Like, the only way we could get millions of people on it in a way that worked is as these apps. And I'm really curious because you were brought on the board of Twitter in, I believe, 2010, and you saw this moment of Twitter going from this very new growing company to trying to figure out what is its business model and what is its, how does it establish and how does it deal with competition in the market? I wonder if you could talk about sort of that, what it was like to be on the board.
It was an amazing time to be on the board of Twitter. As you said, they were basically entering this kind of defining moment. Dick Costolo had just become the CEO. Ev was still on the board. Jack was still on the board. And at that time, Flipboard, which we had started just about a year earlier, was one of the largest, if not the largest user of the Twitter API. And we basically saw Flipboard as effectively like a social browser. It connected Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, that all these folks had APIs to
The era of
bring
the
people
mashups.
together. Exactly. And there were a number of people who were like building just really cool new experiences with the Twitter API. And I was a huge advocate for that. And so that was one of the big reasons why I ended up joining the board. And, unfortunately, the business side of Twitter, as Jack talks about, on your first episode, great episode, by the way. I think
Thanks.
that moment where, Twitter's management team started to think in terms of like a walled garden business was when I was there. And ultimately, I also saw like, wait a minute, this API could get shut down. My whole company is built on this API. Now I have a conflict of interest. I'd have to leave the boardroom when they would talk about these APIs. I'm like, okay, guys, this is getting a little too weird. So ultimately, I left the board because it was clear I was.
Which is a shame, because we needed you to, if the conflict of interest hadn't been there, you could have better advocated for the open thing, which,
Yeah,
I think Twitter would have been much better off for.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe I would have been able to prevent Twitter from ever have being sold to Elon, which I think was unfortunate, a very unfortunate thing. I view Twitter as had the potential to be the lingua franca of the internet. I really saw that the way Jack talks about it, as like it really started out in his world as a protocol, and it became gradually a business, right? And so, that I think that moment in time was a lost opportunity. Now, what's really great is that, Jack then set about to like, okay, how do I get a protocol built here at Twitter? And at Proto and Blue Sky was born, right? And really good things came out of that. And now we're off, to the races with, a vibrant protocol. We have actually 3 protocols now, which is, in and of itself a bit of a challenge. But
the fascinating thing is because they're open protocols, they're not entirely separate. I
right.
on Nostr follow thousands of people from Mastodon servers and also Blue Sky servers and back and forth. And I have this weird thing where I have like my Mastodon user, my Blue Sky user, my Nostr user. They all follow each other. And then I'm like, should I repost my post from one to the other? And, sometimes things get lost. I think we're in a moment where we have a creativity that's going on right now. I think that the Fediverse and ActivityPub had gotten a little stuck before Nostr and Blue Sky and App Protocol came along, where people were sort of happy with where they are. They've got a really nice, relatively small set of communities. They've got the Mastodon servers that do their own moderation. And there were other protocols. You had ones around events, and you had ones around photos and video and things like that are all sort of built on top of the protocol. But they didn't figure out privacy or how to separate who's hosting your identity from who's hosting your content, from who's hosting your algorithm, from who's doing your moderation. Like, it worked at the scale of a few million people, but it wasn't going to get beyond that.
I think each one of these protocols has something to offer, in terms of where we ultimately land here. I remember when email was happening, right? We had POP3, we had IMAP, right? Like the key
we
is
never talk about those now.
Right. Well, the key is that, normal people could open up an email app and they could send an email and it just worked. Whether it went over what protocol, it's like, that's for technologists to handle, and, companies and things like that. The point though is that they're connected, and, I can email you no matter what app you're using. That used to not be the case. If you had to use AOL and I had to use AOL in order to email each other, it's insane, right? But that's how it used to be. That's how it is with messaging right now, right? With direct messaging. So what we need to do, independent of these protocols, which all have very good ideas and really great, opportunities built around them, is continue to advance the user experience so that normal people can understand. And normal people, as in like my teenage daughters, they can get on and they're not thinking like, okay, I let me pick what protocol, let me pick, they see someone that they love to hear more from, they want to connect with, a creator who's got great videos, and they just follow that person, and it just works. And they can follow that person from any app, regardless of the protocol, regardless of the app, right? And we are on the threshold of that.